Chapter 13. Such men are dangerous. Here is the situation in the world. First, there are the legionaries of the new spirit. They are veterans of the shape of things to come, pioneering the superforce which changes human nature. They see the war of ideas clearly. They fight unitedly on a world front to usher in a new age of new men and new women to answer the oncoming might of materialism with the fire of a great awakening. Then there are the regiments of militant materialism, the shock troops of the isms. They, too, see the war of ideas clearly. They also fight on a world front to establish the oldest form of jungle rule, the godless dictatorship of the world by one section of it. Finally, there are the missing and misty millions. For a long time, I was one of them. They are the lost souls of history. They have yet to recognize the war of ideas. They say that the world is in a mess, but do not believe they had anything to do with putting it there, and cannot see that they have any part to play in pulling it out again. They all want to have the other fellow changed, and are all waiting for the other fellow to begin. Because they do not see the war of ideas clearly, they are often unconsciously made the dupes and tools of the militant materialism. The materialists constantly strive to win these missing and misty millions to their side. The materialist's strategy is to dupe the ordinary man, for if they are to ride to power or opulence, they must ride on his back, having convinced him that they are offering him a lift to the top of the hill. So they have mastered the technique of the confidence trickster, the card sharper, or the obliging gentleman in a flash tweed suit who sells you a gold brick for half a crown. They persuade the ordinary man that it is in his interest which they have at heart. In fact, they use him for their own gain. The materialists work with anybody so long as unconsciously he serves their ends. Thus Hitler used men as stepping stones in his rise to power, and then killed them when they finally saw where he was leading them. Then in various lands the Marxists work with clergy, monarchists, intellectuals and liberals, anybody at all who will further their ends, and liquidate them when they feel strong enough to do so. And it is all done under the camouflage of fine words about progress, liberation, self-expression, and such like. The first materialist of all, the snake in the Garden of Eden, did his work in the cause of higher education. The ordinary man, who is allured by the bright promises of the materialists, is like the fish which swallows the bait. He loses his liberty. He goes into the pot of the militant and organized materialist forces to increase their feast of power or pounds or pleasure. Throughout history, he is a pawn in their game. Some militant materialists are frank enough to say so. Hitler bluntly declares his contempt for the mentality of the masses, though it raised him to power, and says you must manage the ordinary fellow by ruthless propaganda. He will always swallow the big lie, even if he hesitates over the little lie. Lenin is even more explicit. In What Is to Be Done, he urges that every grievance in the heart of the ordinary man must be stimulated and exploited for party ends. Our task, he says, is to utilize every manifestation of discontent and to collect and utilize every grain of even rudimentary protest. Is there a single class of the population in which no individuals, groups or circles are to be found who are discontented and therefore inaccessible to our propaganda? You get similar exploitation of the masses by organized materialist influences in Britain, though they are not always so frank about it. Thus some newspapers peddle pornography at a penny a time for the sake of sales and dividends. Some big financial interests regard people as things and use the masses as a mere source of revenue. There are intellectual, artistic and political circles which for years have propagated their faiths of license among the ordinary men and women of Britain, so that they may have company and justification for their own pleasures in sex. Opinion which drove men out of public life for gross immorality was dangerous to them. There are the agitators who promote industrial unrest to increase their political power rather than to improve the lot of the working classes. All these and many more materialists in Britain exploit the ordinary man. They use us, and they bring out the worst in us. They have three main tactics in dealing with us. Tactic number 1. They play on weakness. A demand is growing for sexual instruction as part of school and university teaching. A fine scheme, until it gets into the wrong hands, as sometimes it does. Then the secret idea back of it is not that our young men and women shall learn self-discipline, but that they shall be taught to indulge themselves with a decreased risk of venereal disease or babies. Then there is a steady campaign to make divorce easier and swifter, and some of its advocates are no doubt sincere people. But these sincere people fail to recognize the final objectives of the militant materialists. That is, to degrade the whole conception of marriage from a Christian institution into a civil contract. It is the same policy that made Hitler's Nazis take with them immense stocks of pornographic literature when they marched into Poland. This was a main weapon of their assault on the morale of occupied Poland. In the same way, before the war, Marxist agitators were active in the European schools and universities and elsewhere, giving lectures and free education on sex. If you can get people soft and unable to say no to themselves, they find it difficult to say no to you, and their resistance to your big idea is broken down. Tactic number 2. The materialists bid for the misty millions by playing on man's capacity to hate. People enjoy hating almost as much as they enjoy lusting. Men like a grievance. They like to have somebody else to blame. It puts them in the right. It makes them feel good. So the subversive elements get to work. They take a situation like the relationship between Britain and America and seem to undermine it. The Yanks are out for what they can get. They care nothing for you, the subversive forces say to Britain. The British are out for what they can get. They care nothing for you, the subversive forces say to America. Everything American is sneered at and derided by the subversive forces in Britain. Everything British is sneered at and derided by the subversive forces in America. For these forces know that if these two countries fall out, there is little hope for the rest of the world. So a main aim for them in the war of ideas, now being fought on a global scale, is the disruption of Anglo-American unity. Also, the subversive elements strive to create hatred between race and race, class and class. The battle line of division runs through every home, wife against husband, parents against children. It runs through industry, worker against boss, capital against labour. It splits nations into sections. It sets the sections battling to control each other and the nations battling to control each other too. Bewilderment, chaos, division, disunity. It is the objective of militant materialism to create it everywhere. Disunity gives the isms their opportunity. Every little friction weakens a nation's defences against the invasion of a militant idea. Divide and destroy. That is the age-old strategy of materialism for men and nations. Tactic number 3. The materialists delude the ordinary fellow by shouting a series of false alternatives and pretending there is no third way. Here are some of them. Look after number 1 first, or your number is up. Grab or go under. Control the other fellow, or be controlled by him. Support Nazism, or you are a Jewish Bolshevist. Support communism, or you are a fascist reactionary. The unhappy husband or wife must choose between divorce or deadlock. Parents between birth control or no control, between spoiling or spanking their children. Government must choose between controlling labour by force or coddling it, between bullying or bribing, between favouring management or liquidating it, between taking all prosperity away from individuals or watching them use it as selfishly as they please. Management must choose between being brutal or sentimental. Labour between strike action or inaction. Britain must choose between exploitation or evacuation of her empire. The peacemakers between exterminating the aggressors or letting them off, and the peoples of the world between being oppressed or rising up in bloody revolution. Of course, there is an answer to these so-called alternatives. The third way of a new spirit that introduces into every equation of hopelessness the new element of change. The positive forces who pioneer the new spirit offer the greatest danger to the materialists. For, of course, these pioneers are not fooled by the tactics of playing on weakness and hate or offering false alternatives. So, the negative forces of materialism use different methods to fool them. They do everything in their power to discredit, misrepresent, and destroy them. That is why Frank Buchman and his men have been ever at the thickest of the fighting in this war of ideas, this battle between MRA and materialism for the soul of the world. In almost every case, the morally defeated and the extremists of the left or right have been back of the assault on MRA. There is nothing new in it. It is the traditional, age-old strategy of materialism. They crucified Christ. 40 men swore an oath they would never eat nor drink until they killed Paul. St. Francis of Assisi was jailed by his father. Ignatius Loyola was hounded from country to country, put on trial and imprisoned. John Knox was locked up aboard the galleys and accused of disloyalty to the state. He was sentenced to death and burned in effigy while he was in hiding. Throughout history, there have always been assaults against the moral and spiritual forces of the age. Today, moral rearmament faces a like attack. At the time they take place, the attackers seem to have the power and to dominate the scene. But history records the achievement of those who were attacked. Few now remember the names of those who locked the tinker's son in Bedford jail for 12 long years. But all know John Bunyan and his Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan, one of our immortal national heroes, who was locked in a dungeon by us, his fellow citizens, for a fifth of his lifetime because of his warrior heart. One feature of the attack of the materialists on those who pioneer the new spirit is that they denounce in these pioneers the quality which is abundant in themselves. This is called projection. I take care to keep away from that crowd of folk. There is something not quite nice about them, as the skunk said to his wife over the telephone. If you listen to some of the things people say as they attack MRA, you discover plenty about the critics. We give ourselves away by our criticism and prejudices. We defend the flaws in ourselves by criticizing them most violently in others. The war against John Wesley illustrates this clearly. John Wesley was a Church of England minister who, when he was almost 35, discovered that his experience of Christ was inadequate. His heart was strangely warmed, his own nature was transformed, and he set out to change his nation. So the attacks began. His own church led the hue and cry. At one point, almost every pulpit in Britain was closed to him. Mobs broke up his meetings. He was stoned, punched, knocked off his horse, drenched with slops. He was accused of making money out of his religion, of sensationalizing God, and of adopting vulgar methods. But the most interesting part of the battle against John Wesley concerns his patriotism. During Wesley's lifetime, Britain was hemmed in by enemies. France was on the verge of revolution and dictatorship, seething with new ideas which dismissed God, morals, and religion as antiquated superstitions. In times of national emergency, the easiest way to smear a man's or a movement's reputation is by denouncing them as disloyal. That is the technique always used by persecutors of religion on these occasions. So Wesley's enemies put around the story, which was widely believed by well-meaning but foolish people, that Wesley was in league with the French, conspiring to land an army of 50,000 on our shores. Efforts were made to cripple Wesley's work by taking the few colleagues that he had away from him. His enemies succeeded in kidnapping some of them and pressing them into military service, while they themselves stopped at home to continue their assault on Wesley. Of course, the forces most opposed to Wesley in Britain were the forces who sympathized most in their hearts with the new and softer and pagan code of morality which was springing up in France and elsewhere on the continent. They sensed that Wesley was the spear point of attack against the materialism of his day. When the war against France came, it was, in fact, an ideological war. "We are at war," said Pitt, "against armed opinions." It would have been quite possible for Britain to win that material war against France and to lose the ideological war by importing France's new totalitarian and godless philosophy of life into Britain. Instead, historians have recorded their conviction, and it is now commonly accepted that Wesley did much to save his nation from revolution. Lecky, the great historian, says, "His work is of greater historic importance than all the splendid victories by land and sea under Pitt." A modern view given by the American commentator Mr. Leland DeWitt Baldwin of Pittsburgh University is, "Wesley rescued the Anglo-Saxon ideal from dry rot, breathed new idea, breathed new life into the soul, and recreated the conscience of England, armed the land against internal revolt, revived the old zeal for social service, shook together the dry bones of empire, and clothed them with the flesh of understanding, integrity, and honest goodwill." Thus, Wesley, dubbed by his enemies as disloyal, was in fact a source of national strength, while self-styled patriots who opposed that resurgence of the spirit which was his life work were the source of national weakness. Incidentally, while Wesley saved Britain from revolution, at the same time he created the seedbed for the biggest advance the working classes of Britain have ever known. From him men like Shaftesbury and Wilberforce drew the inspiration for their vast program of social reform, and it was from that seedbed of spiritual values which Wesley left behind him that the early pioneers of the labour movement sprang and grew. Through persecution to maturity, Wesley left one idea behind him, the French materialists another. Lenin remarked that the men who had inspired himself and Karl Marx were these French materialists of a previous century.